So order of the speech, 2 overviews at the top, then case. You can just flow overviews at the top case. We negate start with an overview. HSR will never get built even if we invest 4 warrants. First is lobbying. As Colony 21 explains, high-speed rail is an existential threat to the goals of market dominance, so whenever a project gains momentum, they pour billions of dollars into lobbies, propaganda, and pay politicians. Empirics prove, as Colony furthers, Texas' attempt to build a 200-mile-per-hour line between Dallas and Houston have been smashed by aggressive attacks and lobbying by Southwest Airlines. Second is red states reject free market 10 explains if Republican-led state governments are unwilling to commit on these projects, they simply will not be built. Since rail projects are long-term investments, even if the federal government has already agreed to sponsor an anti-rail Republican could mean putting a full stop in infrastructure development. Job 13 confirms the Obama administration had grand plans for a national high-speed rail network, but Republican governors spoiled hopes by rejecting federal money. Third is court clocks, as McCordle 19 writes. High-speed rail would require the government to buy all the land between point A and point B and tear down anything that happened to be in the way. Unlike other countries, our constitution gives the government limited ability to displace inconveniently located people and the ability to tie up the government for decades in eminent domain appeals. Any infrastructure project bigger than painting a schoolhouse thus has to fight out the reviews in court cases for years. CTI 13 thus finds the result is a project that will clog and cash-strap courts with condemnation cases. Fourth is worker shortages. Boston 22 finds 93% of construction firms have open positions and 91% are having trouble filling them, particularly among on-site construction workers. Combined with the $1.2 trillion infrastructure law, as well as the $52 billion CHIPS Act and the $739 billion Inflation Reduction Act, there will be a demand for a volume of construction workers that simply doesn't exist. Then another overview, even if it is built, it won't have any ridership. 5 warrants. First is conventional rail. DIR 20 finds nearly all overseas high-speed rail lines that have achieved high ridership attracted mostly from previous rail passengers who upgraded from conventional passenger rail. We have no such large volume of passenger rails between U.S. cities. Second is fare cost, as Munden 15 finds that the current projected fare for the train is $86 a ride. In contrast, Dallas 22 finds bus passengers were charged on average $58 for a monthly pass. This is crucial, as Varda Median 15 finds that fares will be one of the most important factors in choosing to ride the bullet train. But third is car culture. The U.S. has had a car-centric mindset for decades. Affirming doesn't change that. Meltap 21 finds that U.S. cities are not built for carless modes of travel. Borelli 21 expands, for most American families, cars are a crucial element of daily life. 91% of households have access to a vehicle. The rate of ownership vehicle is on the rise. Hence, Johnson 19 concludes that 99% of drivers will not be affected by HSR. Fourth is population density, as Millsap 21 finds that HSR does not perform well where population density is low. America's current population density is low compared to other countries with extensive rail systems. This is key since Ring 18 finds insufficient population density is a critical precondition to low ridership. BBC concludes that once built, most high-speed rail lines often go on to lose money. There are only a few examples of high-speed rail networks that profit only in high-density areas. Fifth is time, as Ring 18 explains, the travel time to stations are offsetting. Security will be in place for high-speed rail. Boarding time offsets. It is going to take twice as long to travel from SF to LA via high-speed rail versus an airplane. Every single warrant is a prerequisite to all their arguments empirically after having low ridership. Button 17 finds that when financial costs are higher than revenues, HSR services such as between Shanghai and Nanjing, which opened in 2009, closed after 10 days. With that, our sole contention is cost. Rails are expensive. Millsap 21 finds that it will cost at least $1 trillion to build a national HSR system, and O'Toole 21 estimates building a system longer than China's would cost at least $4 trillion. Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg's proposal on high-speed rail would add to the federal debt to subsidize operating costs. Empirically, in China, Liu 18 finds that Chinese corporate debt levels rose from 100% of GDP to 190%. The HSR network is a debt crisis waiting to happen, with many lines incapable of repaying the interest on their debt. Unfortunately, when the U.S. increases their debt, they are forced to sell bonds. This is bad, as Caprita 18 finds. A destabilizing effect of U.S. debt are a diversion of significant amount of available global capital away from emerging market economies and into the purchase of U.S. Treasury securities. The World Bank 17 quantifies that a 100% basis point increase in U.S. bond yields could reduce capital to emerging economies by 45%. Crucially, Bayoria 8 terminalizes that a 1% decline in developing country growth rates trap an additional 20 million people into poverty. This is especially bad now, as Nagle 22 writes that 38 emerging economies are in danger of a debt crisis or are currently experiencing one. Empirically, during the 1980s in sub-Saharan Africa, because of the U.S. Jones 16 terminalizes that the number of people living in extreme poverty increased by 125 million. That's where Pratt's negated.
Okay, everyone ready? It's mission on YAP, and I'm the first speaker, Rahul Pasha. Okay, good? Everyone's ready? Awesome. I'll start time now. Zed and I affirm, our sole contention is blood in the water. After almost a decade of uncontrollable growth, America's economic prosperity is beginning to wane. Top analysis firms calculate a 98% chance of a recession within the decade as the alarms begin to sound. Indeed, after 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction, Professor Hank of Johns Hopkins University explains the U.S. is headed for a whopper of a recession within the decade, with Professor Stephen Roach of Yale concluding that it would take nothing short of a miracle to avoid the imminent economic collapse. All signs are pointing to a crash as Cox 22 of CNBC reports the Federal Reserve isn't selling long-term assets, signifying a decrease in investor confidence moving forward and pressuring the government to spike interest rates. Meanwhile, Diggler 22 notes that with inflation at a 40-year high, Americans have little to no money to plan for the future, protect against emergencies, and make ends meet. Thus, he concludes that 43% of Americans are expected to fall deeper into debt by the end of 2023. With blood in the water and the sharks beginning to circle, we need to take it to resilient economic growth to patch the scars the COVID recession has left us. Thus, high-speed rail will illuminate this road to recovery in 3 beneficial ways. The first is a real estate rumble. Oleg 22 explains that the housing market has seen 8 straight months of decline, with high interest rates leading to a 50% decrease in home ownership and new construction. Fortunately, Coons finds that high-speed rail allows workers to commute vast distances, taking pressure off high-demand neighborhoods and opening up new housing markets in rural regions. Thus, Yang 18 concludes that land and housing costs decrease by an average of 33% after high-speed rail lines are built. This is critical because according to Harvard University, 40 million Americans are at risk of losing a roof over their heads because of these astronomical prices. Ultimately, paying the rent is a question of having a bed to sleep in, making the housing crisis the biggest threat to America's lower class. Second is clearing the smokestack. Dr. Callahan of Dartmouth College explains that environmental pollution has caused $1.8 trillion in losses due to polluted resources, declining crop yields, and poor health outcomes. The C2ES21 explains that 29% of all carbon emissions come from overused trucks and cars, making road-based transportation the largest contributor to the climate change conundrum. Luckily, the USC writes that high-speed rail would revolutionize transport while emitting 16 times less than the current system. Because they run on electricity, Yang 19 explains that high-speed rail reduces environmental pollution by 7%. This is key because pollution has made lung cancer the second leading cause of death in America, killing 130,000 people every year. Overall, even marginal reductions in climate change could keep us under the 2-degree warming threshold, and by doing so, Wilson 18 explains that 153 million lives could be saved globally. Third is fantastic freight. Thompson 19 writes that America's decaying infrastructure poses a threat to our future. Indeed, a report by APTA this year found that road traffic and congestion accounts for $140 billion in lost time and productivity as goods spoil and wages are not collected. Even worse, the Department of Transportation notes that total freight demand is expected to grow by 35% by 2040, beyond the current capacity of the aging freight system. Luckily, Lou 21 writes that a high-speed rail would double the capacity of rail-based freights, lowering shipping costs. This is critical because Glendo 22 explains that small businesses and consumers have experienced record inflation rates because of these supply chain failures and delays. Parado 21 concludes that a 1% rise in inflation also results in a 7% increase in poverty. Devastatingly, inflation also means people can't afford food, education, and healthcare. In many cases, it's the difference between life and death. That's why Val 22 finds that a 1% rise in inflation also decreases life expectancy by 0.24%. These are frightening statistics. For context, our calculations based on NCVI data indicates that a 10% rise in inflation would reduce life expectancy by more than the pandemic did. For these 3 reasons, high-speed rail can prevent another devastating recession when the world is at its most vulnerable. The growth from industrial development in cities and new businesses that will spring along rail lines will foster poverty reduction and long-term economic growth. That's why Propo 9 assures that investing in new railways will fuel our economy and help us get through the recessions of the next 50 years. Because the US is the largest and most interconnected economy on the planet, a study by Boston University finds that economic crises like the one in 2008 had a prolonged global impact, pushing almost 100 million people into poverty globally. Thus, mission affirms. Ready for prompts?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay, awesome.
So, could I take the first question?
Yes.
Cool. So let's talk about housing, right? Would you agree that HSR will pretty much primarily only be built between like the urban areas?
Yeah, the main stations are going to be in urban areas, and obviously to connect those distances, there'll be like secondary cities and more rural areas that'll be connected along the way. So like, for example, if we're connecting San Francisco and LA, you have like Bakersfield, Fresno, Modesto, a lot of these other cities in between them, they'll also be able to access the high-speed rail.
So why would high-speed rail then actually build like stations in these rural areas? Doesn't that like take away from its profits?
Why would that be true? If a lot of people want to live in, say, like Fresno or Tracy, and then commute to work in San Francisco, they would be able to get a lot of ticket fares and riders by building a station there, right?
I would tell you that there's like just not enough people in those places for HSR to be like beneficial to put stations in there, but that's fine. You can take a question.
All right. So, do you believe in climate change?
It's pretty cold outside right now, but yeah, I do.
You do?
I do.
All right. So, how are you going to solve for climate change if high-speed rail is not built?
Well, we tell you that actually high-speed rail getting built is exacerbating climate change. Construction emissions are really bad.
Okay, but like, aren't we constructing other things like now, like expanding highways? Like, isn't that a lot worse than building high-speed rail, which is a green form of transportation?
Yeah, but the problem is that building high-speed rail, like the construction emissions would be like far too high for HSR to be able to like to remake any of its emissions in a reasonable amount.
Well, that's pretty much for every single thing, like solar panels, windmills, and everything. Like they all require emissions to create the green technology, but then in the long term, that solves for the issue of climate change.
How long do you think we have to reverse climate change?
Well, it's not reversing climate change. Climate change is a scalar impact.
That's fine, sure.
I think it's 4,200 tons of carbon dioxide that gets emitted, one person dies. So it's a scalar impact. And if we see even like a 0.1% decrease in like the temperature globally affects millions of people, and it decreases the severity of natural disasters and like declining crop yields and all these terrible impacts. Do you want a question?
Yeah, sorry, my Sheets is doing something really weird.
So that's why paper doesn't lag.
Facts. So let's talk about inflation, right?
Yeah.
So isn't inflation very high right now?
It is, yes.
Okay, so why haven't your impacts triggered?
Oh, they have. I mean, millions of Americans are like in poverty or they're right above the poverty line because they simply cannot afford basic necessities. Now, high-speed rail would completely solve this issue by connecting the productions of supplies from the productions of the centers of production to the centers of consumption, right? And that decreases the cost of goods overall. Okay, we still have some time to cross. So on your final argument regarding debt, right? So during COVID, we spent about like $2.5 trillion on the stimulus checks and bailouts during the recession. Did we see this effect of developing world debt crises?
I mean, yeah, we're seeing it every day.
Yeah, but what is the cause of many defaults in the developing nation right now?
Well, we would tell you that U.S. debt is high and it keeps increasing, and that's why we keep seeing emerging economies.
I understand that part, but like that's not the reason why emerging economies right now are doing bad. The reason why they're in a collapse is because of the pandemic that basically shut down a lot of their industries. The fact that they had debt did not really. You do
make a point in saying that the status quo is unique right now in terms of these emerging economies are doing badly, but we're telling you that if we keep pushing HSR, it'll push some of them over the brink, and that's really bad.
Okay.
Wait.
It's just gonna go straight down their case. Let's have time start now. Start on their case. On their uniqueness of a recession, two responses. First, you can delink it. A recession is very unlikely, as Harvard 22 finds. If we can bring oil prices down, that's going to help a lot in achieving a soft landing when there's no recession. Gladly, Dom 22 reports gasoline prices are expected to fall below $4 a gallon. Second, you can delink it because their inflation uniqueness doesn't necessarily equal recession, as Scholze furthers. Inflation is not much of a concern. Correlation doesn't necessarily equal to causation. If you go back to 1970, there's going to be the same number of people where an oil price back, or same number of examples where an oil price back led to a recession that led to like an oil price back, and that led to no recession. On a real estate rumble, a few responses. First, you can turn at eminent domain displaces, as Davis 20 finds. High-speed rail projects can use eminent domain power to take property for right-of-way where the owner is unwilling to sell. Prefer this for two reasons. First, on a Lincoln, when people are displaced, they're forced to look for more houses in different areas, increasing demand, which increases prices and pushes minorities further out of affordable housing. Second, on severity, being forced out of your own house and having nowhere to go is infinitely worse than not being able to afford a house. Second, you can turn it because HR causes gentrification, as Gianna 20 finds. In China, the newly launched HR services have induced industrial gentrification in the developed station area. Gentrification makes neighborhoods surrounding the rails more expensive, pricing out those who need the close proximity to cities and transportation and forcing them to move away. This means that the people who actually need the rails are not reaping the benefits, but rather the wealthy who likely already have transportation are. For further on empirics, as Wang 18 conducted a meta-study of HR and its effects on housing prices on 285 cities from 2009 to 2017, found that HR led to a 13.9% increase in city-level housing prices and a 31.7% increase in regional central cities. The after would be devastating, as Goggins 20 finds. Residents who are financially insecure with high housing costs often fall behind on rent or mortgage payments and get evicted. Third, you can delink. In order to assess their impact, they must prove that high-speed rail would have stops in smaller and affordable areas. But Green 17 finds each station will need to maximize commercial opportunities because you can't have too many stops along the high-speed rail line. This means the amount of people who can actually use the train to get from their homes in exurban areas to cities is very limited. On their second link about clearing the smokestack, a few responses. First, you can turn it because of efficiency. By burning massive amounts of fuel for long distances, White 09 concludes HR produces twice as much CO2 per passenger kilometer as a non-high-speed train. Second, you can turn it because of fueling, as O'Toole 09 concludes, most electricity in the US comes from fossil fuels, with the result that urban rails generate more greenhouse gases than an ordinary car. Third, you can turn it because HR construction destroys the environment, as Job 21 explains. The entire California high-speed rail project would generate 9.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide during construction, and that's just California. It would take 71 years of operation at medium capacity to offset these emissions. This is crucial, as Job furthers. By the time HSR commences service, more cars will be fully electric, and the rail system will never pay back the carbon investment required to build it. On their 153 million air pollution impact, it's about global air pollution, but you could non-unique because job furthers, even the extremely unlikely event that HR's annual emission savings were to be realized, the project would only reduce global emissions by about 0.01%, meaning there's no way they can solve for all of these deaths. On their third link about fantastic freight, first you can turn to HSR freight is too expensive. As Wagon 22 finds, Rail currently provides low-cost, long-distance transportation for heavy freight, which HSR is unlikely to do given its higher cost and the track damage caused by heavy trains. HSR will compete with the domestic air cargo industry, though its historically poor profitability suggests lackluster returns. Empirics prove, as Bone 21 quantifies, high-speed rail freight is about 70% more expensive than conventional lorry. Second, you could delink it because HSR can't do freight, as O'Toole 21 confirms. Because of the lightweight equipment required for high-speed trains, such trains are incompatible with heavy freight trains for safety reasons, so such routes will carry zero freight. Third, you can turn to because HSR kills freight. As NPR 13 finds, Amtrak pays private companies in the center of the country to run its low-speed passenger trains on freight rail tracks, but high-speed trains would need their own tracks, depriving the freight rail system of some of that revenue. Prefer this A on probability because you know that current freight has been effective in the SQO, but HSR jeopardizes this thriving industry for an uncertain probability of solvency. Second, you can prefer it on empirics, as Jane21 finds in China. When examining the volume of freight shipment, there were negative effects on rail freight tripping. This suggests that the new HSR construction can possibly crowd out investments in conventional transport infrastructure and conventional freight delivery systems. And so for all these reasons, we're very proud to negate.
Can I just see grammar correct? So it's gonna be a little goofy, Kate, but I'll signpost well, okay? So we'll start on their second overview. Okay. Kinda sick. Actually, wait, no, start on the top of our case. Sorry, my bad. So our case, and then signpost from there. At the top, they say recession's unlikely because oil prices are going down. There, $4 evidence is an average across the United States. Sure, prices might be lower in rural areas, but in metropolitan hubs, where the majority of US population density is structured, that's where you see high gas prices, which is why the majority of Americans are looking for more public transportation options. This fundamental narrative of our case is undercovered in their last speech. They say that they said that in the 1970s we didn't see any kind of recession. The OPEC oil embargo literally caused a recession inside the United States. This is our argument. We are headed towards a structural failure of the US economy, and high-speed rail is the only way to revitalize that. Go to their case, their second overview. I'll concede all the warrants fine. High-speed rail never gets used by people. That's really important. One, on the argument about real estate on our case, this kicks out of the gentrification turn insofar as nobody would be moving next to the high-speed rail, because who the hell wants to live next to a freight train, which means that doesn't increase housing prices. On the eminent domain turn, it's pretty simple. Eminent domain is a Supreme Court case that was upheld in 1870. We always put these people back above market rate for their housing, which means they live more productive lives in the long term. On the argument about clearing the smokestack, I'll concede their last piece of defense is that global air pollution goes down by 0.1%. This means taking into account all of their evidence and the responses from above. HSR is still an on-net net reduction for carbon emissions, which means you still buy our arguments. Also, the comparative isn't between HSR and no infrastructure. In their world, obviously you build and expanded conventional transportation, things like roads, which are uniquely terrible for the environment. On the supply chain, this is where you can vote. They say that you trade off with airlines, but this doesn't make any sense. Their argument, they literally don't understand the grammar of their own card. It says the airlines are the ones that generate diminishing returns. They bracket in HSR right before it, which means that this doesn't really apply. But then second of all, the more you ship, the lower the cost per unit, which is why in China they're considering expanding HSR for freight and connect it with Europe. They say that O'Toole says that they can't do freight. I'll indict that evidence on their case, but also why they also concede in their next response that HSR innately would use new tracks, which probably means that it can't run freight, but also it's fine. We don't run heavy freight, we'll run other types of freight, which frees up other supply chains in order to run different types of shipping. On the Amtrak response, this doesn't really matter. The reason Amtrak has to trade off is because they don't have enough federal funding, but HSR, per their own argument, is expensive. It's an increase in funding, which means that on net they would have enough money. Go to their case. On the first overview, at the top group, all the warrants, the Mankendo evidence does the analysis for you and says that if federal investment is way better. All the examples they talk about is primarily state funded. When you increase federal funding, you get federal oversight, federal insight, and federal engineering tips, which means that you would be able to A, decrease the amount of time it takes to build high-speed rail, but B, you'd be able to avoid all the cost overruns that they talk about, which independently takes out all of their arguments. On lobbying, train companies would probably lobby back, but then second, this argument takes out their second warrant about red states rejecting, because the fact that Texas even proposed a high-speed rail proves that the politicians are not averse to having it. On the red states argument, the majority of people who get support from red states get support from construction jobs. High-speed rail increases construction jobs and lower income jobs, which is why it would probably increase their support. On court clogs, their argument concedes that you'd be shifting over to the appellate circuit, which can still run while we're building high-speed rail. They never concede why. They never tell you why this is going to decrease overall efficiency overall. But then on shortages, this doesn't matter. A, we have a surplus of construction workers right now. But then second of all, the reason there's a shortage is because there's minimum wage jobs that people don't want when you build high-speed rail. They also concede that you increase the wages, which increases the incentive for people to work in the industry. Go to their first argument about debt. Their $4 trillion evidence is terrible. A, it's from an indicted author. When Tool is funded by an oil company, obviously he's going to tell you that it's really, really expensive. And two, it doesn't make any sense why high-speed rail is that expensive. Once you have the existing stations, it's probably super easy to just build an extra couple miles of tracks, which is why the proc evidence that they dropped in their last speech tells you that high-speed rail is on net a good automatic stabilizer. On the whole developing world thing, A, the people who buy developing world bonds are probably doing so because it's a gamble. They can generate high returns, which means there's an incentive to do it in either world. But then second of all, their evidence about a 45% decrease in capital flows is talking about other countries raising their interest rates when the US does. A, the US doesn't raise interest rates anymore when we do deficit spending because we know that our assets are most attractive to investors, so we don't need to increase their yield. But then second of all, developing countries don't increase their yield when the US does anymore because the MIM evidence indicates that they know that the United States is a country that operates in its own vacuum, so they don't see any point in mimicking their monetary policy. There are 125 million evidence people going into poverty is non-unique by our case because we're also talking about collapses of the global economy, which means that their impact is at best non-unique for those reasons we've heard. And I'm ready for crossing.
Let's start time now. Let's talk. Okay, let's talk about your responses or your frontline to our environmental terms, right? You just say that you'll concede the 0.01% of emissions for global things. How does that respond to the two terms we read that probably implicate also on the national level about your like 480,000 deaths?
Number one, it would have been fantastic if you made an implication rebuttal. But two, if there's a 0.1% decrease in emissions overall, that probably means that taking into account all your evidence.
Okay.
Oh, let me finish, Doc. Come on. That taking into account all your evidence, you still see a net decline in carbon emissions because there's a 0.1% decline for your own evidence. I'm taking the question though. Let's talk about. So you talk about costs, right?
Yeah.
So hold up, like I'm super confused, right? So, like, why? What type of dude buys like Nigerian debt bonds, like to service the country's debt?
I'm not an investor, but
Yeah. So a fun fact, right, is that I actually own a few shares of like
okay.
Laos debt, right? Do you know what's funny about buying emerging market debt?
Uh-huh.
It's basically just gambling,
Uh-huh.
okay? So the fundamental fact is that people like me, average Joes, who just buy the bonds, do so because they're like, sick, dude, I can buy it for like $5 and I could like make $50 if the economy booms.
Uh-huh.
It's like, why does that incentive not exist in your world?
Because no, wait. Our argument is that
I know your argument, just answer my question, bro.
What was your question?
Why does the incentive for massive returns and like low and like high risk, high reward, right? It's a gamble. The same reason people go to the casinos.
So it's basically,
why does not exist in your world?
because if we use like your $5 to $50 analogy, let's say that's like 20% probability. For us, it's like the US bonds have maybe $5 to $10, but they have like a 75% probability.
Yeah, I understand
So
that, but it's a
wanna make
different
money.
asset class, right?
Right.
I know they want to make money, but like I want to make big money while also putting in like the cash that I get from beating you at cards, for example, right? And like the debt bonds are pretty much the only way to do that in terms of international
Okay,
treasury. So the
we'd say
incentive
like
still exists.
it's kind of hard to characterize what an investor likes. We'd say the best way to
it's
characterize
not.
it is that they
It's just
want
logic.
money, not necessarily that they want high risk money,
Wait.
just that they want money.
Yeah, I understand, but it's a different asset class, right? Investors invest in different assets for different reasons. Sure, they might invest in the US because they want guaranteed returns, but no idiot buys a developing world debt bond because they're saying, this is going to allow me to feed my kids and like put food on the table.
Well, yeah, they
You
might
can have a question though, or not, if you want.
yeah, I'll just quickly respond, right? Like even if they buy developing world bond and the US bond, it still necessitates a slight trade up. Anyway,
This
let's
doesn't say that. Cost.
yeah, that evidence right there. But okay, let's see. So let's talk about eminent domain, right? So
Wait, where's that?
Your
Okay.
frontline to eminent domain. So you tell me that the government gives people resources, right?
Yeah.
Are these enough to make back their displacement and them totally losing their house? And
I mean, I told you that the people probably, okay, A, the house is an asset, right? Which means that they probably pay back the value of the asset. But then two, I told you that the government has an incentive to pay them back at market rate because if not, obviously they're going to sue them and they don't want to get sued, which is why they probably just pay them above market rate so they get the money. I'm taking a question.
Okay.
Let's talk about, You have terrible handwriting. I can't read anything. Okay, that's gross.
That's gross.
So order of the speech is going to go our case, their case, white. Cool. Look at our case, you're voting against this round on HSR not getting built, extending court clocks. When Article 19 writes that high-speed rail would require the government to buy all the land between point A and point B and tear down anything that happened to be in the way. Unlike other countries, our constitution gives the government limited ability to displace inconveniently located people and the ability to tie the government for decades in eminent domain appeals. Any infrastructure project bigger than painting a schoolhouse has to fight out the court cases for years. CTI 13 thus finds that the result is a project that will clog and cash-trap courts with condemnation cases. They just say that some type of court solves. Their evidence is that people can't sue if it's not for public use. HSR is literally for public use. They can most definitely sue. We've seen it happen before, and that's the CTI evidence that's conceded. Also, extend worker shortages. Boskin 22 finds that 93% of construction firms have open positions, 91% are having trouble filling them, particularly among on-site construction workers. Combined with a bunch of acts, there will be a demand for a volume of construction workers that simply doesn't exist. They give two responses. They tell you that there's workers looking for these jobs and that HSR jobs are better, but groupies, they completely conceded Boskin evidence from this year that 91% of companies have open jobs in the construction industry and literally can't build them. You can't build HSR without workers. It's that simple. With that extent, our case, Millsap finds that HSR will cost at least $1 trillion, a large portion of which will be funded via deficit spending. Unfortunately, when debt rises, the U.S. sells bonds to investors, which is bad as the World Bank quantifies a 1% increase in U.S. bonds, decreases capital to emerging markets by 45%. Unfortunately, Bayoria finds that a 1% decline in growth traps 20 million people into poverty, which is horrible. As Dungle finds that the developing world is on the brink of a debt crisis, and Jones finds that the last debt crisis in the 1980s pushed 125 million people into poverty. First, they say O'Toole is funded by oil. No, it's Cato that's funded by oil, not O'Toole. And O'Toole got fired from Cato, which probably shows he's not an oil billionaire. But second, they say there's high risk, high reward. No, these investors want to make money. Our evidence indicates empirically that rising bonds have always diverted capital from emerging markets. That's the Caperta evidence. Also, they have a misconception. They think that these investors are buying bonds from abroad, but they're actually buying U.S. bonds. But third, they say our World Bank evidence is wrong. No, it's talking about rising bonds and the impact of the developing nations. This takes out freight, because if the entire developing world falls into a debt crisis, there's no one to export freight to, which stops their impact in its tracks. No pun intended. Also, it outweighs on empirics. The last debt crisis pushed 125 million people into poverty. Moving on to after eminent domain turn is game over extended. Turn. Eminent domain displaces. Davis 22 finds the high-speed rail project can use eminent domain to power to take property and right away when the owner is unwilling to sell. My God. Prefer this for two reasons. First, on a Lincoln, when people are displaced, they're forced to look for more houses in different areas. The increasing demand, which increases prices and pushes minorities further out of affordable housing. But beyond severity, being forced out of your house and having nowhere to go is significantly worse than not being able to afford a house. You can extend their impact on 40 million people not having a house on their side, onto our side. They just say that the government gives these people resources. They have no example of this. The government has always failed to do this effectively. They just displace people to the bare minimum to survive, which is infinitely worse than their case. Then on freight, extend the turn. HSR freight is too expensive. Wagon 22 explains rail currently provides low-cost, long-distance transportation for heavy freight, which HSR is unlikely to do given its higher cost. Empirics prove Boeing 21 quantifies high-speed rail freight is about 70% more expensive than conventional lorry. And for these reasons, we're proud to negate.
Okay. We'll take some prep time. Yeah. Starting. All right, cool. It's gonna go our subpoint C about supply chains, freight, and then I'll signpost from there. Okay. Everyone good? Actually, wait. I'll start on blank and then go to supply chains. Okay. Start time. Now, there are two arguments in this round. Theirs about a developing world economic crisis, and ours about fixing supply chains. We prefer our impact for a few reasons. First, on time frame. When you build high-speed rail now in the next few years, you can use it for decades at a time, preventing recessions and economic crises for the next 50 years. That's the Prop 9 evidence that has been conceded. That's really, really important because our impact is preventing economic crises that spill over into the developing world that's starting in the United States for decades, while they're just talking about one economic crisis tomorrow. The second reason for us is because mostly developing economies are mainly export economies, meaning they make raw materials and they manufacture them and they ship it to the United States. If we don't have proper supply chains in the US to get those goods from our port cities to the rest of American consumers, we don't have enough profit to then pay for their materials, and then their export economies actually decline. The third reason for us is that their impact is literally just pushing 125 million people that are right above the poverty line into poverty. That's a very small magnitude impact. Just the word poverty is actually not a very big distinction if they're right above the poverty line. We're talking about economic crisis and preventing them that pushes people that were maybe middle class or low middle class into desperation. At that point, for our case, they give you one response. First, let me extend the link. We tell you that right now the high-speed rail station will be able to double our freight demand. Why is this important? Because right now our our supply chains and freight is completely broken. We're going to need 35% more freight shipping demand, and that's not actually possible with our current aging freight system. It's simply way too slow, way too inefficient. That's why during COVID we saw inflation because we weren't able to get goods from the center of production to the center of consumption. At that point, by building high-speed rail, we can efficiently transport goods from producers to consumers, decreasing costs, decreasing inflation, and again, buffering our economy for the next 50 years. The only response they give is that somehow It's way too expensive to ship. First of all, the uniqueness is on our side. Even if it's more expensive, suppliers are still able to use it because they're getting faster shipping and cheaper costs overall on transportation. Secondly, remember the cost per unit goes down when you ship goods in bulk. So even though maybe when you start off it's 75% more expensive, but as time goes on and we use it for decades at a time and we advance our system, it becomes cheaper. But finally, their evidence is really, really bad. The misplaced the comma. It's talking about the airline industry being really, really expensive and not a good idea. That's why freight is so much better. At that point, it's very clear you can drop your pen and vote for this contention. Let's go to their case, group their turn by gentrification and port clogs. They're basically on the same thing about eminent domain. You can group that and their thing about the worker shortage. Again, with federal revenue and federal investment that is substantially increased as per the resolution, we have federal oversight, which solves for all their issues because the cost decreases and you're able to pay workers more so they actually want to work in this industry. Right now, there's a 91% decrease in workers because they're given minimum wage. No one wants to do that. They're better off with welfare in the status quo. On the court clogs and gentrification, 3 problems here. First of all, court cases can be done in the background like we did for the highway system. And overall, if we don't build high-speed rail, we're just going to spend that money to expand highways, which is so much worse because it's much more expansive. One high-speed train is just a few train tracks going in one direction, not an expansive highway network. But finally, people are compensated from the federal government, not state governments, but the Constitution said they have to be compensated for their property value above market rate so they can go on and move to other areas and have a better quality of life. On emerging markets, again, these investors are very different. The people that invest in like Nigeria or Laos, they also want a very risky investment. They're not just there for the safety, but also they completely concede the fact that the developing world is no longer matches U.S. interest rates. So even if U.S. interest rates increase, which again, the U.S. doesn't do anymore because we're a safety asset, it doesn't matter because the developing world won't match that. So interest rates don't increase in the developing world, meaning they're not going to fall into a debt crisis. Ready for Graham?
Yeah, can I take the first question?
What if we all stood up and faced each other?
Yeah, let's do that.
Oh god.
Okay.
Come on, you go.
We should do something like this. There we go. Like a duel. Oh, can we have some of the hats? Actually, you can have all. It's more comedic that way.
What? I don't get the hat. I'm your partner.
Okay, let's go.
Ow, it's an abrasive head. Your head's so small.
Thank you. Okay.
Let's go.
Yep. So, so let's talk about worker shortages. So, are you telling me that right now there are unemployed people who are rejecting existing jobs and waiting for better government jobs?
Yeah.
Yes, it's simply because right now the U.S. during COVID they gave tons of stimulus checks and other forms of welfare, and they expanded the welfare state. So for many people, it's better to just not work and get that welfare rather than go to a minimum wage job and lose it. That's why when you have government funding and you have government jobs to construct the high-speed rail, more people will be inclined to work for them because they have higher wages than just the union wages right now.
Maybe having a question.
Of course.
Sure. Fantastic. Okay. How do developing countries make the cash? How do they make cash?
Yeah, how do they get investment?
From investors. No. No, what do they do for money?
Yeah.
They sell crap, yeah?
Sure.
Like trees and stuff,
Sure,
right?
and steel,
They still.
Okay.
coal.
Yeah, like to cut it down.
Okay,
Okay,
cool.
so if they do that, right, and
Yeah.
the US is like, oh crap, we can't take stuff from the ports where we import and distribute them across the United States metropolitan areas. We don't have that.
I mean, they probably export to a few other countries other than the U.S.
But the U.S. is
Yes,
again the
like-
largest, most interconnected
Wait,
economy.
I missed
Yes,
I missed
but I
something.
don't-
Why does the U.S. have trouble importing this? What's the problem?
No, we can import
the
them,
issue
but we
isn't
can't
bringing it
get
from
the-
the country.
Yeah, we can import them. Make sure you can explain.
Okay, thank you. So the issue is not bringing it from the port in the other country to the United States, because that's a ship, and a ship is not a train.
Okay, so you're talking about transporting it throughout the U.S. when it
Yes,
gets-
intra-U.S.
Intra-US, yeah.
Okay, so existing freight is not enough.
This is
Yes,
our argument.
it's way too little, and again, we're going to increase the demand for freight by 35% in the next few years, and our current system just cannot handle it.
So-
It's
so-
talking about
okay,
ships,
you-
right?
wait,
What's
wait,
really
wait,
important to know
wait,
is
wait,
that the
okay,
Peter
okay.
Griffin evidence tells us that high-speed rail is very, very versatile, right? You can have trains on the water and boats on the tracks.
Okay, could I ask you something? So you provided zero warranting for why HSR can carry light freight when you said it can't carry heavy freight.
Oh, wait, no, I definitely did.
And you just dropped the response.
You
You also
didn't
said
say,
it
you
in
didn't say the
response.
response, which is
Yeah.
definitely not too cool. But then second of all, I'd say, if you're not carrying, what constitutes heavy freight? You're probably not heavy freight.
Well, but we
the
say
chairs and
the
the
heavy
passengers
freight is
probably-
probably enough for them to actually.
No,
Yeah, no,
no,
so
no,
what
the-
our thing is about freeing up other supply chains, right? That's the response, that's from Zed gave that you dropped. So, and you also didn't extend the response, that's why I
We'll
think
take
it's
a
different.
question. We'll take a question.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So, for the people who you talk about going 1% above, 1% below the poverty line, what is their livelihood like above and below?
Yeah,
Given that,
what's the
they probably
change?
fall in and out of poverty on a weekly basis, basically.
Depending on like their weekly.
Where did this 1% above or
Yeah.
below the poverty
You
line?
said
Yeah,
you
this
said
is
people
Ronald's
have
saying that
25
I mean,
million
it's
people
almost
right
the
above
same as
poverty line and
your,
they're
it's like the
pushing
same as your impact.
No, it's not.
No, it's not, because a recession is a complete economic collapse. People get like laid off and
like a
jobs and
total
stuff.
debt crisis, right? Like, sure, people who are above the poverty line also fall into poverty. People who are also like above the poverty line also fall.
Could I get a really quick
You
question?
literally just repeated
Can I get a
Why
yourself.
you ask me the question while they're talking?
Okay, so
Okay.
so
Okay,
on
let's
your recession impact, right? You tell us that a recession is imminent. What's the time frame? Like, what's the time frame of HSR getting
Within
built?
decades.
Also, the Nintendo evidence says that you build it hella fast, because the government's built up good.
Oh no, you're asking about the recession.
I mean, Bob the Builder's overseeing the project. We won the round.
Okay. Use your hat.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
you have 28 seconds.
6 points.
We're gonna start those 28 seconds.
Yeah.
Time. Now, start on core clock, extended. McCardle 19 writes, high-speed rail will require the government to buy all land from between point A and point B, ensure that anything that happened to be in the way. Unlike other countries, our government gives the government limited ability to displace inconveniently located people and the ability to tie up the government for a few decades in eminent domain appeals. Thus, CTI finds that the result is a project that will clog the cash out with condemnation cases. They extend a couple responses. First, they say you can do this like in the background. This is a new response. We say that they can still like clog the courts because if they go to court and they sue the government, then they can't do. That's why California and other states haven't built a single line of HR. Second, they say that highways also displace people. This is brand new analysis. We'd say high-speed rail probably displaces more people as highways. You just have to expand, but high-speed rail is a whole new system. Third, they say people are compensated. That's like on the eminent domain. That has nothing to do with court clogs. Anyway, okay, let's go to cost then. Extended. Millsap finds that HR will cost at least $1 trillion. O'Toole finds it will cost $4 trillion, a large portion of which will be funded by deficit spending. Unfortunately, when the debt rises, the U.S. sells bonds to investors, which is bad because the World Bank quantifies a 1% increase in U.S. bonds, degrades capital to emerging markets by 45%. Badger quantifies a 1% decline in growth, traps 20 million to poverty, which is horrible as Dungle finds the last debt crisis pushed 125 million to poverty, and there's 38 developing nations on the risk of a debt crisis. On this high-risk, high-reward analysis, neither side really knows what investors want. That's why you look to our case first, because it conceded Capretta evidence that higher debt diverts capital from emerging markets than the conceded World Bank evidence that's an empirical quantification. They try to extend some a response to it. We say it's not about interest rates, it's about bonds. The World Bank literally says a 100 basis point increase in U.S. bonds, not U.S. interest rates. Let's look at the way. First, their time frame is way too long. They can quantify when the next recession happens. We say it happens right after you feel because we invest $4 trillion into the investment. Don't let them try to pursue the HR can be built in the next couple of years. That's not going to happen. Also, on their Lincoln, we said we still Lincoln because if the entire developing nation suffers a debt crisis, they can't export to use. There's no precedent for like the freight to even happen. We also say we outweigh on empirics because this last debt crisis pushed 125 million to poverty. On supply chains, they have conceded the wagon evidence that the rail primarily provides low-cost, long-distance transportation for heavy freight, where HR is unlikely to do, which is why Boehm quantifies high-speed rail is 70% more expensive than the conventional lorry. They just say we like misquoted evidence. The Boehm evidence literally says high-speed freight is 70% more expensive than the alternative. I don't know what they mean. There's literally no brackets here. I quoted the direct sentence. It's like an independent clause in the sentence, and for these reasons, we're very proud to affirm. Then begin.
Independent clause.
Yeah, grammar, you know.
Okay. We'll take some prep time.
Now, in their last piece, they never implicate their core clogs argument against any of ours about free. You can't evaluate it. But then second of all, what they concede to the Manchendo evidence is that federal funding means federal expertise, federal insight, in addition to other federal oversight that allows us to check back from all the court clogs. That's really important because they don't interact with the analysis that the that the suing that's going to happen is happening in appellate courts, which can go on while the high-speed rail is being built. They give you the example of California. It's never explained why California is the best example to prefer. Don't evaluate it. But then second of all, the Manchendo evidence says that none of the other past examples like California apply because they only had state funding, whereas federal funding steps in, brings federal oversight, and all of the other solvency mechanisms that we spoke about. On their argument about debt, you're going for our second response, which explains very simply that the developing countries never raise their interest rates when the United States does anymore. Their Capretta evidence is talking about a 100% basis point increase in bond. Bond yields is a synonym for interest rates. Simply put, countries no longer raise their interest rates when the U.S. deficit spends anymore, which means that these emerging market outflows never happen. On the weighing debate, their weighing passes by like a ship in the night. They never explain why it applies to our case. Their case is talking about the countries not being able to export to the United States, whereas our freight argument is about intra-U.S. supply chains. These don't apply on the same level. At that point, if we win any of our weighing mechanisms, we're very simple. We're solving for time frame for decades at a time, whereas their argument is a singular recession, which might push people 1% below or above the poverty line. It doesn't matter because our argument is about structural poverty. Then you can vote immediately on our supply chains argument. Let's go there. Very simple. Right now, our freight capacity is expected to be exceeded by 35% in the coming years, but high-speed rail doubles the capacity of freight, meaning that we can transport goods from from production to consumption, which means that we decrease the price for the average consumer, but also allows us to expand the supply chain during times of recession to buffer and automatically stabilize the economy for the next 50 years. They say it's too expensive, but they concede both front lines. One, cost per unit goes down when you ship in bulk, which is why companies would probably just do that. But then second of all, they also concede their own evidence is a misplaced modifier. They try to come up with this grammar BS, but they concede Rahel's analysis that says that, okay, fine, maybe that's the case, but it's so expensive right now that we either spend now and or pay later. That's why you always prefer our analysis. The weighing is conceded, the link is conceded. That's why you're voting for VP on yeah. Thanks.
Good debate. Good round.
So sad, bro. It's like the last time we hit each other for a couple months.
Is it?
Yeah, me and Rahul like.
Yeah, we're not gonna be competing after that sometime. So.
Oh.
Thank you for judging.
Are you guys good for Stanford?
Yeah, okay, we'll see you then.